But anyway, without further ado, let's begin. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you this evening to our new session of Art Talks. Thank you very much for coming. I just want to introduce our two speakers. First, Ashwini Bhat, whose solo exhibition we are in the midst of a solo exhibition. Ashwini lives and works now in California, though she was here as a classically trained dancer and also trained in literature. And Bhat uses ceramic sculptures, installation, video and text to develop a unique visual language exploring the intersections between body, nature, self and the other. I think this is her first solo in India and we are very proud to host it here at Project 18. How to introduce Ranjit? Ranjit is he's like a really acclaimed and seminal contributor to Indian art criticism and curatorial practice. I think he's also here as a poet this evening. And he was a curator of India's first National Pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2011 and co-curated the 7th Wanted Biennale with Oakley and Resort in 2008. And after we finish our conversation, I would then like to invite Forrest Gander to read his poems. Forrest's book, Be With, was awarded the 2019 Pulitzer Prize, and he is a United States artist, Rockefeller Fellow, and has received fellowships from the National Endowment of the Arts and the Guggenheim. Welcome, Forrest. So, on to you, Ranjit and Ashwini.
Thank you, Shri.
Shri, thanks so much for having us. And Ashwini, it's a real pleasure to be sitting in the midst of your sculptures, which I last saw at an earlier degree of progress in your studio in Petaluma.
Yes, Pengrove.
What's that?
Pengrove.
Pengrove, indeed. Oh, I must have Petaluma. Pengrove.
Which is the closest city. Yeah.
And thank you all for being here this evening. I thought I might just begin by bringing together some thoughts on where these works might come from. So if that's all right, I could just launch into that and then we take it from there.
Yeah, sure. First of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. As Shri mentioned, this is my first solo exhibition in India, and most of the work here has been taking shape for the last few years, but this exhibition particularly has taken shape along with many conversations I have shared with Ranjit. There is a collaborative project which is seen behind the wall. You can spend some time with it after this conversation. But that's not where the collaboration begins and ends. I was just to go 2 steps back, just only to come 4 steps forward. I was working on a solo project in 2021 for Shoshana Wayne Gallery in Los Angeles, and thinking about California landscape and California ecology and connecting it to the nature spirits of India, and also looking at ecological practices within ritual performances and harvest festivals. And that's where I got really obsessed with the idea of yakshis. So which is kind of beginning of 2021. And I think it was in 2022 when I first brought this up with Ranjit that I want to go deeper into looking at yakshis, but do not want to get trapped with the idea of religious motive. And it is when Ranjit recommended Ananda Kumaraswamy's book by the name Yakshas, which became like the central foundational aspect for this show to come together. So thank you, Ranjit. The show developed in multiple segments, almost like the idea of upakathas, which also came together through various WhatsApp, Zoom conversations I shared with Ranjit over the last year. But the Yakshis kind of hold the entire concept here together. Yakshis, as many of you know, are nature spirits who were extremely popular within Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, temple architecture, Pahari miniature. The idea of them as women who were wronged at some point in their lives, who had the capacity to come back to life and avenge their death, became a beautiful metaphor for me to fall back on, to think about California landscape, which comes back to life after each wildfire. I lived a nomadic life between 2011 and 2017, living out of 2 suitcases, hopping from one residency program to another, finally to set roots in California in 2017. And my introduction to California, which is to Petaluma, I think that's why you remember Petaluma very well. Everything I owned in that country belonged in like half a dozen cardboard boxes. And even before I opened them up, a city next to us, which is called Santa Rosa, which is only 20 miles from us, was literally burned to the ground overnight. And we in Petaluma were getting ready to evacuate at any given point, had our cars gassed up and phones charged in case we had to leave homes in the middle of the night. Until that point, fire had been kind of only a positive reinforcement in my work, baking things I make in clay in fire. So I wanted to better understand the phenomena of forest fires. Also, I felt like by then I had already kind of fallen in love with California. And everyone kept telling me, oh, this is not how California was. Things are changing. It's an open secret of living with the changes of climate change. It is not just theoretical in California. But people kept saying, oh, this was not the same way even 20 years ago. I felt like I fell in love with the California, which was already of a faulty landscape. So I wanted to familiarize myself with the landscape which I was introduced to, not something which could have been many years ago. So I started going out on research trips with a bunch of biologists, poets, including my partner here, Forrest. And I didn't have a studio for close to 8 months. So that also felt like a beautiful time for me to familiarize myself with the landscape and see what I wanted to make if I had a studio in the next few months. Coming back to the studio almost 10 months later, the way I looked at the work changed dramatically. I started placing myself in the work a lot more. Everything here you see is a self-portrait. I think the origin of that goes back to 2017. So looking at landscape which comes back to life, almost like a Yakshi comes back to life, became like a starting point for this show. And the color palette has been developed over the last 8 years, again thinking about new life emerging out of scorched earth. Yeah. But also, I went to see the Yakshis in the Chhatrapati Museum here, and there was a beautiful moment standing in front of a Yakshi, sculpture which had only the nose shining. And I've tried to do similar things here in my glaze treatments, where part of the body, the figurine is half woman and half plant, but also some part of the body has the shine and some part has the scorched ground, memory of the scorched ground.
Yeah. Ashwini, I'm thinking of how you've drawn on in this body of work, but generally on impulses or tropes or figures that first came to you through your earlier life as someone immersed in literature and translation and as a classical dancer. I'm thinking, for instance, of how the Yakshi or the Yaksha, I mean, these are guardians of the sources of life. They're guardians of water, primarily. I mean, that's a figure that inhabits, in one way or another, the work of A.K. Ramanujan,
Yes.
of Girish Karnad. These are figures who are very important to you as a student of literature. Also, gestures like the tribhang. I mean, how do you render the figure of the yakshi as someone who dances between, say, water and earth or earth and air? Do you want to talk a little about this, about the persistence of your earlier disciplines into this, which is a dialogue with a whole different set of parameters, with clay, with fire, with different kinds of temperatures, with the unpredictability of a kiln? So do you want to talk a little about that movement from, if you will, canonical disciplines to a more unpredictable practice?
Yeah, sure. I mean, dance, working with body is unpredictable as well.
This is true.
And I know from my own experience, having had a few injuries, how one navigates with that, how one continues to navigate. But yeah, I think I never thought of myself as I moved away entirely from my dance practice or my literature background. But once I found clay, it was truly liberating to find this material which was like outside of the body, you know, like you could break it and reform it. And it gave me the freedom of like feeling like a child, to be truly fearless. And I needed that at that point of time. But it was also this question of, a question which was asked of me many times: do you miss dance? Do you want to go back to dance? And I have toyed with that question as well. And I knew that I would be going back to it in my own way, and it could be through sculpture. And I think that's what you see here as well. I really appreciate you noticing the Tribhangi, especially that piece over there. I am thinking about a very specific Yakshi who is holding her hair in a position like this and standing in a Tribhangi pose, but that is also made as a love note for my mom, who is always seen wearing jasmine on her hair. And this piece here, there are 22 segments, and each segment has been formed using thin stretched clay slabs manipulated directly on top of my body, using the body as a tool, but also thinking about the body as a landscape. I think the video is another way of me figuring out a way to go back to performance, and finding my own language of a performance. I've often gone back to Maya Deren. I mean, I've fascinated by her practice. Even when I used to be a professional dancer, that's when I first encountered her work. But the fact that she was not a trained actor, not a trained film director, but found a way to merge both the languages. So I kind of found a way to bring these elements of movements and wilderness and a desire to find a metaphysical understanding of nature and myself through the language of video. Initially, going out into these, research trips felt like, okay, I'm going out into Yosemite, deep into the forest. I'm going to be there with these bunch of biologists who are collecting data, and I'm taking photos and videos and making drawings and see what develops from it. Very soon, maybe 2 years into this practice, I started looking at these research trips as very much part of the foundation of my studio practice. Walking became part of the studio practice. Wanting to be alert in a certain way in the wilderness became part of the studio practice. I had spent so much time in the community studios. Not until 2020, I had my own studio. So once I had my own studio, the quietness of the studio became very much like the quietness of the forest. And that became kind of an interesting conversation. And there's something happens in that alertness, in the quietness, that you can feel like you can be truly naked, be open to your own vulnerability, and try out things which may be of utter failure, which again took me back to the day one of finding clay, after moving away from dance. So I think this coming back to these points is the way how I have developed this show as well. Again, the idea of the upakathas.
Yeah.
If you want to know the entire story, you need to read the sub-narratives.
So I want to take you along one of those sub-narratives. I mean, there's one, out of what you said, we are pointed in the direction of Akamahadevi,
Yes.
but also the way in which this eco-poetic practice questions the great American myth of the wilderness. But we'll come to those two. Before we do that, I just wonder if you'd like to, because this is something that fascinates me, to talk about the long apprenticeship that you had with Ray Meeker. Because, we've talked about dance, we've talked about sculpture, as though it was one day to the next.
Yeah.
But between these lies this long and arduous and really pretty much a Gurukul style of apprenticeship. So could you just talk about that?
Of course. I wouldn't be here without Ray. I met, so Ray Meeker is, for those of you who don't know, is a fantastic artist who is in Pondicherry, who started Golden Bridge Pottery. Many of the people who are working in clay in India right now are his students. And he comes from Southern California, and almost like a full circle, I have now landed up in California, and we talk about that quite often. My introduction to Ray's work was in Nrityagram. I wanted to join Nrityagram when I was 16, but my parents didn't have the means to send me to an actual Gurukul system. They wanted me to still be in Puttur, finish my education, and then take up dance as full-time. time if I still wanted to do that. I encountered Ray's terracotta sculpture, terracotta temple, and fast forward 5 years later, 2003, I met Ray at Chandralekha's front
beach.
room. In fact, as I'm speaking this, I'm wearing Chandra's bangles, which I inherited. So these are the people who made me. When I met Ray, I was still working with Padmini Chetur, but 3 years later, when I thought I was taking a break from dance for a year until I figured things in my life. I went to Ray to ask if he could take me as a student. There are all these urban myths around Ray that he takes only 3 students a year, which is true, that there is a long waiting period, 3-4 years of waiting, which is also true. Most of the time, the wait is because Ray is someone who never checks his messages or emails. And I never wrote him an email. I just landed up in his doorstep because my introduction to Ray in his studio was watching him work on a 20-foot giant blob of clay with a paddle which was bigger than his head, made out of mango wood, beating on it. And I said, I want to do this. And I want to learn from this guy. So I went to him and said, well, I have very little money, so I can no longer live in Chennai. So I'm moving to Pondicherry with everything I've got, and I'm going to show up outside your door until you take me. And he said...
This is how they do it in the Upanishads.
He said, oh, the next course starts in 2 weeks. Join. And a year later, I asked him what made him take me. And he said, I didn't care if you had never touched clay in your life. You had the discipline of a dancer. Yeah. And that's what was enough for me. And that's how our teacher-student relationship began. My entry into clay was through watching Ray build sculpture, but the training was almost like a Japanese apprenticeship program. For the first 3 months, whatever you made, you never stored, you never kept. You chucked them into the clay bin, you reused the clay, you understood the nature of the material, kind of going back to the title of my show as well. He was a teacher who would teach mostly by being quiet. So the more you observed, the more you learned. And that's the kind of teacher I was looking for at that time. And even to this day, he's kind of the first one I send images to show the work. And yeah, it's just been, if you think about being at the right time, that has definitely happened to me in my life, and Ray is one of them. Yeah.
I'm also struck by how your practice is somehow at the intersection between, I hesitate to use these slightly pointless terms, but a certain kind of modernist emphasis on producing singular, expressive, mysterious objects. And on the other hand, what seems like a contemporary artistic practice that's based on research and expedition and that kind of direct encounter with landscapes, for instance, or which is interdisciplinary in some way. So I've been curious, are there other outcomes of this second aspect of your practice? I mean, this one we see, which is the well-achieved object. Is there another aspect in terms of journals or records of these expeditions? What form does all that take? Do you want to talk a little about this? Is there a writerly practice?
I don't know. I kind of, I think I used to have a much more rigorous writerly practice when I was a student of literature and when I was actively translating. I do keep notes, but I don't really call them journals. I've thought about keeping journals, but never really can keep up to it. I think I have photographs collected and drawings, mostly in the form of journals. But if I can go back to the beginning of your question, this thing of the tradition and the modern, that is something has been a constant thing in my mind in terms of how to place the work. Also knowing that almost everything I make has a reference coming from India, but no longer living in India, and placing the work in a Western art language. I see a question forming. Do you want to?
A thought.
Yeah.
Which is that, as you were saying this, I remember that Kumaraswamy, who we spoke about, at one point got sculptors like Epstein, for instance, very interested in Indian culture. So there's a moment in so-called Western sculpture, which actually is heavily indebted to classical Indian sources. You see it in Epstein, you see it in Brancusi, you see it in a number of Eric Gill. I mean, you see it there. So I wouldn't be in a hurry to make that kind of distinction between what is Indian and what is Western, if that word even means anything. But I can see that that has strategic implications. I mean, how do you present yourself in your context, which, as it happens, is California, with the present complex politics of race, of ethnicity, of location? So could you talk to us a little bit about that? What is it meant to become part of that community and that context with its very volatile politics?
It is complex. It's taken me about 8 years to be recognized as an artist where I live right now. Simply because one of the reasons is I didn't go to school there. So there was not this immediate peer support. I happened to live almost 2 hours away from any city. So it's remote. So in some sense, the feeling of belongingness in that landscape happened with me finding home within the landscape. My immediate community for nearly 5 years were poets who belonged to my partner's community. Yes. Also, the immediate community was climate activists. I got very involved with nature walks, and one of them we went together with. And recently I became a naturalist so that I can take school children on guided trips to these nature hikes. So I think the visual artists as my community has happened only in the last 1 or 2 years. And as I'm saying that, someone, a friend, walks in. So, there's always this connection happening. But I met somebody who stopped by in a studio once, who was from New York area, who moved to California 35 years ago. And he said he still calls himself a New Yorker. And he was really surprised that I was already feeling comfortable calling myself a California person. And he wanted to know where that belongingness came from. And I think it kind of goes back to where I grew up, how I grew up, in Puttur, in the wilderness. There was absolutely nothing else to do other than reading books, sitting under the trees, and being in California, connected to this landscape. My work became about ecology of the landscape. And then it kind of the work became more than myself. And then it kind of felt like my work had a much more larger meaning, a larger presence, a larger calling. And I think that changed everything for me to how I came to kind of understand myself as an artist, how I wanted to place myself an artist in the community. Yeah. Did I answer?
No, in fact, you're pointing me towards something else I've been thinking about in relation to both your practice and Forrest's. It's the way in which you sometimes dedicate yourself to a place which may be in your immediate geographical and cultural context, or it may be elsewhere, however that plays out. But it has this sense of an expanse, something greatly larger than your finite possibilities. And with both of you, that's been the San Andreas Fault,
Yes.
right? Which you've explored and responded to and borne witness to. So do you want to talk, whenever you've talked about it, both of you, I've had the sense that this is not an expedition, it's a pilgrimage. So do you want to talk about that a little?
Sure.
Specifically what that has meant.
Yeah. So the initial research trips, I started with the body of sculptures, which is in 2017. And it took me about 3 years to recognize, as I developed the various bodies of work, that everything was centered around either a post-fire forest, or a forest fire, or a hike. So that's when I started thinking through giving one label to these various bodies of work. And that's when the Assembling California project started. The title I borrowed from a book by the same name by John McPhee, who is a geologist and a well-known writer, who travels from one end of California to the other, along with the friend, talking about the complex history of the state. So I kind of recognized that that's what I was doing in my own way. Initially, Forrest and I put up a map of Northern California in our garage and started hiking and coming back and putting a pin on every hike we did. Very soon to realize that there is a pattern being developed in it. Around end of 2020, slowly coming out of the pandemic, I started thinking of the San Andreas Fault. So this is a fault line which forms as the foundation of the entire state, goes through 800-mile long. Everything beautiful in California, which you see right now, is basically the result of this tectonic plate and drama. And Forrest and I started this walk along the San Andreas Fault only in 2021. Because we both live a busy life, we haven't been able to do the entire 800 miles in one go, but that's the goal. We hope very soon we'll be able to do that. This technique of working with the clay slab, manipulating on my body, kind of happened on the edge of Wallace Creek. Wallace Creek is near Bakersfield, which is close to Los Angeles, Southern California. That's kind of the closest point of the fault line you can go to. Forrest and I were there in January of 2021. I have an injury on my left shoulder blade since my dance days. I have been living with that pain ever since. Until 2020, no one was able to really find what was going on with this pain. Nothing was showing up in X-rays or MRIs. Until 2020, a physiotherapist in Petaluma, along with the body worker, was able to figure out what might be going wrong and was able to go underneath my skin to treat the fascia, to treat the inflammation of the fascia. So since 2020, I've been pain-free for the first time. I still have to do various physiotherapy to keep the pain under control, but at least now I know what might be going wrong. Standing at the edge of Wallace Creek, where you're standing simultaneously on two tectonic plates, on North American and Pacific plates, which are traveling in opposite directions. And because they are traveling in opposite directions, they are called a transform fault. I had this kind of outer body experience, almost like I could imagine the land kind of lift itself and reform itself. And when you're standing at the Wallace Creek, you can see that on the left, the geological field is completely dramatically different to the right. On one side, it's all tall mountains, and on the other side, it's much softer mounds. Coming back to the studio, I had another memory of this conversation with my body worker, who tends to work on my back with her eyes closed. Her name is Mara Yetter, and she is just phenomenal. I asked her once why she works with her eyes closed, and she said, I think my hands know more than my eyes, which felt so true to the way I feel about my material. So I started working in a new way where I started setting the clay slab and closing my eyes, started literally going underneath the clay slabs.
Amazing.
And that's where this idea of the slab becoming the second skin came about. So I think everything is kind of connected to how the exploration began outwards in the landscape, only to look inwards to think about the inscape and the landscape, which Forrest kind of introduced me to. Maybe this is the segue.
I was thinking, we should maybe.
Would you like to
Forrest,
read
this might be the moment for you.
Sangam Poetics? Because it's so in conversation with the work. Another thing is we are doing these research trips together, but so Forrest and I wake up pretty early in the morning, and he has his writing studio, and I have my studio on the other end. And for most part of the day, we don't necessarily see one another. And our artistic process, I think, happens in very much in isolation. So it has been kind of a surprising element when the works have been finished and when we exchanged, how things we see together have taken a
Different forms.
visual form, but very different, but alike. Yeah.
Dialogic isolation.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's why the collaboration of work and life works beautifully as well.
Also, to complete the hallucination that we're in San Francisco, I think John Yao just walked into the room and sat down at the back.
Many friendly faces here. Sangram, hi.
Right.
Would you like to say?
No, I'm just station. So don't run. I promise it's going to be short. Just 3 poems. My work is very much in conversation with Ashwini's work, and I have a degree in geology, and I'm very interested in the ecological crisis that all of us are living through. Most of you here know that about 2,000 years ago, there was a blossoming of literature in southern India that came to be called Sangam, or convergence. And contemporary scholars of Sangam poetry argue that for the Sangam poets, the boundaries between inner and outer landscapes, the very stuff that she's talking about, were considered porous, and that the ultimate goal of Sangam poetry was the dissolution of any split between self and landscape, that wherever we are, our feelings are influenced by what is around us, whether we recognize it or not. And that worldview links contemporary ecological theory and eco-poetry to the Sangam tradition. So these poems are also influenced by Sangam, but they're set in California. Forest. Erogenous zones in oaks, slung with stoles of lace lichen, the sun's rays spilling through leaves in broken packets. A force, call it nighttime, thrusts mushrooms up from their lair of spawn, mycelial loam. The whiff of port, they pop into untrammeled air with a sort of gasp that follows a fine chess move. Like memories, are they? Or punctuation? Was it something the earth said to provoke our response, tasking us to recall an evolutionary course, our long ago initiation into the one among others? And within my newborn noticing, have you popped up beside me, love? Or were you here from the start, a swarm of meaning and decay, still gripping the underworld, both of us half buried, holding fast, if briefly, to a swelling vastness, while our coupling begins to register in the already awake compendium that offers to take us in. You take me in, and abundance floods us, floats us out. We fill each with the other, all morning breaks as birdsong over us, who rise to the surface so our faces might be sprung. This is called Immigrant Sea. Aroused by her inaccessibility, he aches for more of her life to live inside him. Watching the breakers, standing so close he can feel heat coming off her wet scalp. What is his relation to this person before him, so familiar and foreign? The way he searches out her face, he searches out himself. Gusts thrash crests of swell. Spring grasses twirl circles in the sand where they stand without speaking. She wants him to know it's all charged, even grass positive, pollen negative. So when grass waves, it sweeps the air for pollen. He feels electricity all around, as though the wild drama of the coming storm were already aware of them, foreigners on this shore. Little sapphire blue flowers speckle the dunes. He wonders if he has let himself flatten out into a depthless sheet, like escalator stairs, whether in the end he'll disappear underground without the smallest lurch of resistance. But when her lavish face turns toward him, beaming, the corners of her eyes wind wet, he yields to that excess. He reappears to himself. And the last poem, as a lot of the sculptures here suggest, life coming out of death, is for Santa Rosa, which is the town that Ashwini was just talking about, that has burned down twice in the last 8 years due to wildfires caused by human malfeasance and global warming. And one of the landscapes in the Sangam poems is called Wasteland, so the poem is called Wasteland. Green grass on the hills had cured by June, and by July, grown woolly and brown, it crackled underfoot, desiccated, while within the clamor of live oaks, an infestation of tiny larvae clung to the underleaves, feeding between veins. Their frass, that fine dandruff of excrement and boring dust, tinkled as it dropped onto dead leaves below the limbs. You could hear it 20 feet away, tinkling. Across the valley on Sugarloaf Ridge, the full moon showed up, like a girl doing cartwheels. No one goes on living the life that isn't there. Below a vast column of smoke, heat, flame, and wind, I rose, swaying and tottering on my erratic vortex, extemporizing my own extreme weather, sucking up acres of scorched topsoil and spinning it outward in a burning sleet of filth and embers that catapulted me forward with my mouth open in every direction at once. So I came for you, turning the present into purgatory, because I need to turn everything to tragedy before I can see it, because it must be leavened with remorse for the feeling to rise. Anthony's heard this poem just now for the third time. It's really like a subliminal horror. Thank you very much.